The longship's hull groaned against the rocky shore as Kenneth Campbell's boots struck the wet stones. Behind him, the Norse warriors hauled their vessel higher onto the beach, their voices carrying across the wind like the calls of ravens. Sharon Chavez pressed herself deeper into the shadows of the cave entrance, her heart hammering against her ribs as she watched the tall figure separate from his companions and stride toward her hiding place. His eyes found hers through the darkness, pale blue like winter ice, and she knew there would be no escape. The other Vikings were already spreading across the shoreline, claiming what they could from the abandoned settlement. But this one moved with purpose toward her alone. Sharon's breath caught as his massive frame filled the cave opening, blocking out the gray morning light. "I was told you are alone," Kenneth said, his voice carrying the weight of distant lands and harsh winters. His accent rolled through the Norse tongue like thunder across fjords. "Let me give you sons, woman." The words should have terrified her. Any reasonable person would have fled or fought or begged for mercy. But Sharon found herself studying his face in the dim light filtering past his shoulders, searching for the cruelty she expected to find. Instead, she saw something else entirely, something that made her pause even as every instinct screamed at her to run. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you are watching from and hype this video in the comments. 3 months earlier, Sharon had been a different woman entirely. The daughter of a respected blacksmith in the coastal village of Ravens Hollow, she had known comfort and security, the promise of marriage to Ethan Johnson, the merchant's son who brought silk and spices from distant lands. Her life had been mapped out in careful lines, each day following the next in predictable succession. The first raid had come without warning on a fog-shrouded morning when the sentries could barely see beyond the village walls. Sharon had been drawing water from the well when the longships emerged from the mist like phantoms, their dragon prows cutting through the gray dawn. The Vikings had swept through Ravens Hollow like a wildfire, taking what they pleased and leaving destruction in their wake. But it was the second raid that had changed everything. The raiders had returned just as the village was beginning to rebuild, their timing precise and merciless. This time, they had not come for silver or grain, they had come for people. Sharon remembered the weight of iron shackles around her wrists, the rough planks of the ship's deck beneath her knees, the salt spray that stung her eyes as the coastline of her homeland disappeared into the distance. She had been one of 20 captives, mostly young women and strong men who could work or be sold in the slave markets of the northern settlements. The voyage had lasted 6 weeks, each day blending into the next in a haze of seasickness and despair. The Vikings had not been unnecessarily cruel, but neither had they shown kindness. They were traders in human flesh, and their cargo was simply another commodity to be delivered and sold. The slave market in Jorvik had been a chaos of languages and currencies. Buyers examining teeth and muscles like they were purchasing livestock. Sharon had stood on the auction block with her head held high, refusing to let them see her break even as her future was bartered away in silver coins and promises of payment. Peter Hughes had purchased her for his household in the settlement of Ironhold, a cluster of wooden buildings perched on a cliff overlooking the North Sea. He had seemed reasonable enough at first, a widower in need of someone to manage his home and care for his young daughter, Helen Turner, who had been left orphaned when her mother died in childbirth the previous winter. For 2 months, Sharon had found an uneasy peace in her new life. Helen was a bright child of 7 years, hungry for the maternal affection she had never known. And Sharon discovered that caring for her provided a purpose that made the days bearable. Peter Hughes was not unkind, though he was distant and often absent on trading expeditions that took him away for weeks at a time. It was during one of these absences that the sickness had come to Ironhold, a fever that started with the fishermen and spread through the settlement like poison in a well. Sharon had watched helplessly as Helen grew pale and weak, her small body burning with the heat that no amount of cool cloths could ease. The child had died on a gray morning in late autumn, slipping away so quietly that Sharon had not realized she was gone until the silence in the room became too profound to ignore. Peter Hughes had returned 3 days later to find his daughter buried in the rocky ground behind their home, and something in him had broken beyond repair. He had blamed Sharon, of course. If she had been a proper healer, if she had known the old ways, if she had cared more, worked harder, prayed to the right gods. His grief had transformed into rage, and his rage had needed a target. Sharon had become that target, bearing the weight of his loss and guilt until she could no longer distinguish between his accusations and her own self-doubt. The beating had come on a night when the winter wind howled around their wooden walls like the voices of the dead. Peter Hughes had been drinking, drowning his sorrows in ale that only seemed to sharpen his pain. Sharon had tried to stay out of his way, but in the small confines of their home, there was nowhere to hide. His fist had spoken the language of his anguish, and Sharon had absorbed each blow like penance for sins she was not sure she had committed. When it was over, when Peter Hughes had collapsed into his bed in a stupor of grief and alcohol, Sharon had gathered what little she could carry and slipped out into the night. The cave had been a refuge of sorts, a hollow in the cliffs where she could shelter from the worst of the weather. She had survived on what she could forage, fish she could catch in the tidal pools, and the occasional kindness of traders who passed through the area and were willing to share a meal in exchange for news of the settlements. It was a hard existence, but it was hers. For the first time since her capture, Sharon had felt something approaching freedom. The cave was cold and the food scarce, but no one could raise a hand to her here. No one could blame her for failures that were beyond her control. She had been living this way for nearly a month when the longship appeared on the horizon, its red and white sail billowing in the morning breeze. Sharon had watched from her hiding place as the vessel approached the shore, recognizing the purposeful way it moved through the water. These were not traders or fishermen. These were raiders. The Vikings had beached their ship with practiced efficiency, their leader directing the operation with quiet authority. Sharon had counted 8 men in total, armed and moving with the confidence of those accustomed to taking what they wanted. She had pressed herself deeper into the shadows of her cave, hoping they would take what they could from the abandoned settlement and move on. But the tall one with the pale eyes had separated from the group, walking directly toward her hiding place, as if he knew exactly where she was. Sharon had wondered if someone in the settlement had told them about the woman living wild in the caves, or if he had simply followed some instinct that led him to her. Now, as Kenneth Campbell filled the entrance to her sanctuary, Sharon found herself caught between terror and curiosity. His words echoed in the confined space, their meaning clear despite the cultural chasm between them. He was offering her something, though whether it was a proposal or a command remained unclear. "You speak as if I have a choice," Sharon said, her voice steadier than she had expected. She had learned enough of the Norse language during her captivity to make herself understood, though her accent marked her as a foreigner. Kenneth studied her for a long moment, his pale eyes taking in her tangled hair, her worn clothes, the careful way she held herself ready to flee despite having nowhere to run. "There is always a choice," he said finally, "but some choices lead to death and others to life." The honesty in his voice surprised her. Sharon had expected threats or demands, not this matter-of-fact acknowledgement of her situation. She was alone, without protection or resources, in a land where a woman's survival often depended on the goodwill of men who had little reason to show mercy. "What do you offer?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "A place in my household, children who will carry my name and inherit my lands. Protection from those who would harm you." Kenneth's voice remained steady, but Sharon caught something else beneath the surface, something that sounded almost like loneliness. "I have wealth enough to provide for a family, but no woman to share it with." Sharon considered his words, weighing them against the alternatives. She could refuse and continue her precarious existence in the cave, surviving day by day until winter or illness or simple bad luck claimed her. She could try to flee and hope to find passage back to her homeland, assuming there was anything left to return to. Or she could accept this stranger's offer and step into an unknown future that might hold either salvation or a different kind of captivity. "Why me?" she asked. "There must be women in your own settlement who would welcome such an offer." Kenneth's expression shifted slightly, revealing a hint of something that might have been vulnerability. "I am not well liked among my own people," he admitted. "They see me as too foreign, too different. I was born in the Scottish Highlands and came to the Norse lands as a young man. I have proven myself in battle and trade, but I remain an outsider." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they wanted to cross. Sharon recognized something of herself in his words, the isolation of being caught between worlds, belonging fully to neither. She had been torn from her homeland and thrust into a culture she barely understood, forced to adapt or perish. "And you think I would be different?" Sharon asked, though she already suspected the answer. "You understand what it means to be alone," Kenneth said simply. "You know the weight of survival, the price of independence. You would not expect me to be something I am not, nor would you judge me for the choices I have made." There was wisdom in his words, Sharon realized. The women of his settlement would have expectations shaped by their culture and upbringing, assumptions about what a husband should be and how a household should function. Sharon had been stripped of such expectations, forced to see the world through the harsh lens of necessity rather than the soft focus of tradition. "If I were to accept," she said carefully, "what would be expected of me? To manage my household, bear my children if the gods will at it, and stand beside me as an equal partner in building something that will outlast us both." Kenneth paused, then added, "I would not force myself upon you. Consent given under duress is no consent at all." The last statement surprised Sharon more than anything else he had said. In her experience, men who held power over women rarely concerned themselves with such niceties. The fact that this Viking warrior, this raider who could take whatever he wanted, was offering her a choice spoke to a character she had not expected to find. "You could simply take what you want," Sharon pointed out. "Your men are armed, and I am alone. Why offer when you could simply command?" Kenneth's pale eyes met hers steadily. "Because a woman taken by force becomes an enemy within your own walls. A woman who chooses becomes an ally. I have enough enemies already." The pragmatism of his answer was somehow more reassuring than pretty words about love or desire would have been. This was a man who understood the realities of power and survival, who knew that lasting partnerships were built on mutual benefit rather than romantic fantasy. "I need time to consider," Sharon said, though she was already beginning to lean toward acceptance. The alternative was a slow death in the cave, and she had not survived this long only to waste away in solitude. "Time is a luxury neither of us can afford," Kenneth replied, but his tone was not unkind. "My men grow restless, and winter approaches. If you come with us, it must be now." Sharon looked past him toward the mouth of the cave, where she could see his companions moving about the abandoned settlement. They were not the savage raiders of her nightmares, she realized, but simply men doing what they must to survive in a harsh world. Much like herself, the decision, when it came, felt less like a choice than an inevitability. Sharon had been drifting since her escape from Peter Hughes's household, existing rather than living, surviving rather than thriving. Kenneth Campbell offered her the chance to be more than just a victim of circumstance, to become an active participant in shaping her own destiny. "I will come with you," she said, the words carrying more weight than she had expected. "But I have conditions." Kenneth raised an eyebrow, but his expression remained attentive rather than dismissive. "Speak them." "I will not be treated as property or chattel. I will have a voice in decisions that affect our household, and I will retain the right to speak my mind, even when you disagree with what I have to say." Sharon paused, then continued, "And if you ever raise a hand to me in anger, I will leave, regardless of the consequences." The Viking considered her words for a long moment, his pale eyes never leaving her face. Sharon could see him weighing her conditions against his own needs and desires, calculating the cost of accepting versus the risk of refusal. "Agreed, Ovidbrain," he said finally, "but I have conditions of my own. You will be loyal to me and to our household above all others. You will not betray my trust or endanger my people through word or deed, and you will work alongside me to build something worthy of the children we hope to have." The terms were fair, Sharon thought, perhaps more fair than she had any right to expect. She nodded her acceptance, and something shifted in the space between them, a recognition that they had just entered into a partnership that would define both their futures. Kenneth extended his hand to her, palm up, and after a moment's hesitation, Sharon placed her own hand in his. His skin was warm and calloused from years of hard work, but his grip was gentle, almost reverent. They stood like that for several heartbeats, two strangers taking the first tentative steps towards something that might, with time and effort, become trust. "Come," Kenneth said, releasing her hand. Let us gather what you wish to take, and then we will go to your new home. Sharon's possessions were few and easily gathered. A worn cloak that had been Helen's, a small knife she had used for preparing food, a piece of polished stone that reminded her of her father's workshop. Kenneth waited patiently as she collected these meager treasures, making no comment about their humble nature or small number. As they emerged from the cave together, Sharon felt the weight of curious eyes upon her. Kenneth's men had paused in their activities to watch their leader escort a strange woman from the cliffs, their expressions ranging from surprise to speculation. She lifted her chin and met their gazes steadily, refusing to show the uncertainty that churned in her stomach. "This is Sharon Chavez," Kenneth announced to his crew, his voice carrying the authority of absolute command. "She will be joining our household. Any man who shows her disrespect answers to me personally." The message was clear and unambiguous. Sharon was under Kenneth's protection, and any threat to her would be considered a threat to him. The men nodded their understanding and returned to their work, though she caught several of them stealing glances in her direction. Andrea Bennett would have been proud of her, Sharon thought suddenly. Her sister had always been the bold one, the one who took risks and made her own way in the world. Andrea had married for love rather than convenience, and had paid the price when her husband died young, leaving her to raise 3 children alone. She had managed it, though, through sheer determination and refusal to accept defeat. The longship was larger than the vessel that had carried Sharon into slavery, its hull decorated with intricate carvings that spoke of craftsmanship and pride. Kenneth helped her aboard with careful courtesy, ensuring she was seated comfortably before giving the order to push off from shore. As the ship moved away from land, Sharon found herself looking back at the cave that had been her refuge for nearly a month. It had been a hard place, cold and lonely, but it had been hers in a way that nothing had been since her capture. Now she was once again placing her fate in the hands of others, trusting in promises that might prove as fragile as morning frost. "Regrets?" Kenneth asked, settling beside her as his men worked the oars. "Second thoughts," Sharon corrected. "Not quite the same thing." Kenneth nodded as if he understood the distinction. "I have had my share of both. The key is to learn from the regrets and act despite the doubts." The wisdom in his words reminded Sharon that this man was older than she had initially thought, probably in his 4th decade, with the kind of hard-won experience that came from surviving in a world that showed little mercy to the weak or indecisive. There were lines around his eyes that spoke of squinting into harsh weather and distant horizons. Scars on his hands that told stories of battles fought and work done. "Tell me about your home," Sharon said, wanting to distract herself from the growing distance between the ship and shore. "Iron Haven," Kenneth replied, his voice taking on a note of pride. "Built on a natural harbor with good fishing and protected anchorage. We have perhaps 30 families, mostly engaged in trade and fishing, with some farming in the inland valleys. It is not the largest settlement, but it is prosperous and well defended." Sharon listened as he described the layout of the town. The wooden halls and stone foundations, the workshops where craftsmen produce goods for trade with distant lands. It sounded like a real place, a community rather than just a collection of buildings, somewhere a person might build a life rather than simply exist. "And your household?" she asked. "A hall large enough for a family, with good stone foundations and timber walls. There are outbuildings for storage and workshops, and land enough for gardens and livestock. I have 2 thralls who help with the heavy work, Jerry Powell and Paul Long, both good men who have earned their freedom but choose to stay for wages." The mention of thralls gave Sharon pause, reminding her of her own recent status as property rather than person. Kenneth seemed to read her thoughts in her expression. "They were captured in raids, as you were," he said quietly. "But they have been with me for 5 years now, and I have offered them their freedom more than once. They choose to stay because they have made lives for themselves in Iron Haven, found wives, and started families. Sometimes the bonds we forge in adversity prove stronger than those we are born with." There was something in his tone that suggested personal experience, and Sharon wondered what bonds Kenneth himself had forged and broken over the years. She was beginning to understand that this man was more complex than he appeared on the surface, shaped by experiences that had taught him the value of loyalty freely given rather than compelled by force. The voyage to Ironhaven took 3 days, during which Sharon gradually became accustomed to the rhythm of life aboard the longship. Kenneth's men treated her with careful respect, neither overly familiar nor coldly distant. They seemed to accept their leader's decision without question, though she caught them watching her with curious eyes when they thought she was not looking. On the second night, as they sheltered in a protected cove, Kenneth shared his evening meal with her and began to tell her more about the life she was entering. He spoke of the seasonal rhythms that governed their existence, the trading expeditions that took him away for weeks at a time, the political complexities of dealing with neighboring settlements, and the occasional demands of the regional jarl. There will be those who question your place in my household, Bureau, he warned her. Some will see you as a foreign intruder, others as a sign that I am not content with Norse women. You will need to prove yourself through actions rather than words. Sharon nodded her understanding. She had faced similar challenges in Peter Hughes's household, where her status as a thrall had made every interaction a careful negotiation. At least this time she would be entering as Kenneth's chosen partner, rather than his property. What of children? She asked, broaching the subject that lay at the heart of his original proposal. Kenneth's expression grew thoughtful. I am not a young man, he said. I have perhaps 15 good years left, maybe 20 if the gods are kind. I would like to leave something behind when I go, sons and daughters who will carry forward what I have built. But I would not force the matter. Children should be welcomed into the world, not imposed upon it. The gentleness in his voice when he spoke of potential children touched something in Sharon's heart. This was a man who understood the responsibility of creating life, who saw parenthood as a privilege rather than a right. It was a refreshing change from the casual assumptions she had encountered from other men. On the third morning, Ironhaven appeared on the horizon like a promise made manifest. The settlement, perched on its cliff-top perch, looked exactly as Kenneth had described it. Wooden buildings with sod roofs arranged around a natural harbor where fishing boats bobbed at anchor. Smoke rose from countless hearths, and Sharon could see people moving about their daily business along the waterfront. As their longship approached the harbor, word of their arrival spread quickly. By the time they reached the dock, a small crowd had gathered to greet them. Sharon saw women among the watchers, their faces curious and speculative, as they tried to make sense of the stranger their neighbor had brought home. Kenneth helped her from the ship with the same careful courtesy he had shown throughout their journey, his actions clearly stating his regard for her to anyone who cared to observe. Sharon straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin, meeting the curious gazes with as much dignity as she could muster. Welcome to Ironhaven, Kenneth said quietly, his voice meant for her ears alone. Welcome to your new home. The walk from the harbor to Kenneth's Hall gave Sharon her first real look at the community she would be joining. Ironhaven was larger than she had expected, with well-maintained streets in buildings that spoke of prosperity and civic pride. Children played in the dirt between houses while their mothers worked at looms or tended gardens. Men repaired nets and boats or worked at forges and workshops. It was, Sharon realized, a normal place where normal people lived normal lives. The Viking raids that had torn her from her homeland were just one aspect of these people's existence, no more defining than any other form of work or trade. They were farmers and fishermen, craftsmen and merchants, parents and grandparents trying to build good lives for themselves and their children. Kenneth's Hall stood on a slight rise overlooking the harbor, its timber walls dark with age and weather. It was larger than Peter Hughes's house had been, with carved posts supporting a high-peaked roof and smoke rising from a central hearth. Outbuildings clustered around the main structure like chicks around a hen, each serving its own purpose in the complex economy of the household. Jerry Powell and Paul Long emerged from one of the workshops as they approached, both men wiping their hands on leather aprons. They were younger than Kenneth, probably in their third decade, with the kind of solid build that came from years of physical labor. Their faces showed surprise at seeing their master return with a woman, but they quickly schooled their expressions to polite welcome. Jerry, Paul, Kenneth said by way of introduction, this is Sharon Chavez, who will be joining our household. Please see that the guest chamber is prepared for her use. The two men nodded and moved to comply, but not before Sharon caught a meaningful look that passed between them. They were clearly curious about this development, but too well trained to ask questions in front of their master and his guest. The interior of the hall was both grander and more comfortable than Sharon had expected. The main room was large enough to accommodate a dozen people around the central fire pit, with carved pillars supporting the roof and tapestries hanging on the walls to keep out drafts. Benches and tables were arranged for both work and leisure, and she could see doorways leading to private chambers and storage areas. "It is larger than I need for one person," Kenneth admitted, following her gaze around the space. "But I built it with the hope of filling it with families someday." Sharon could see the loneliness in the oversized space, the way it echoed slightly with their footsteps and voices. This was a hall designed for children's laughter and women's conversation, for the bustle and warmth of a thriving household. Instead, it had been home to one solitary man and his two servants, a monument to unfulfilled dreams and deferred hopes. "It has good bones," Sharon said, running her hand along one of the carved posts. "It just needs life breathed into it." Kenneth's smile at her words was the first truly unguarded expression she had seen from him. For a moment, the careful control slipped away, and she glimpsed the man beneath the warrior's exterior. Someone who had been waiting a long time for the right person to help him transform his house into a home. The first weeks of Sharon's new life in Ironhaven passed in a blur of adjustment and discovery. Kenneth had been true to his word about treating her as a partner rather than property, consulting her on household decisions and respecting her opinions even when they differed from his own. The guest chamber he had provided was comfortable and private, giving her space to adapt to her new circumstances without pressure. Donna Nelson, the wife of one of Kenneth's trading partners, became Sharon's first ally among the settlement's women. She was a practical woman in her fifth decade who had raised 4 children and buried 2 husbands, giving her a perspective on life that Sharon found both comforting and instructive. "Kenneth Campbell is a good man," Donna told her one afternoon as they worked together preparing wool for spinning. "He has been alone too long, I think. Some men grow bitter in solitude, but he has grown patient instead. You could do much worse." Sharon appreciated the honesty in Donna's assessment. The older woman made no attempt to romanticize Kenneth or their arrangement, but neither did she dismiss the potential for genuine partnership. It was the kind of practical wisdom that Sharon had learned to value during her months of hardship. Helen Turner, Peter Hughes's daughter, had been much in Sharon's thoughts during those first weeks. The child's death still weighed heavily on her conscience, and she found herself wondering if there had been something more she could have done, some knowledge she lacked that might have saved the little girl's life. It was Kenneth who finally addressed her obvious distress, approaching the subject with the same direct honesty that characterized all his dealings with her. "You carry guilt that is not yours to bear," he said one evening as they sat by the fire after the day's work was done. "I've seen that look before in the eyes of warriors who survive battles that claim their comrades. Survival is not a sin, Sharon. Neither is the inability to prevent every tragedy." His words were like a balm to wounds that had been festering for months. Sharon found herself telling him about Helen, about the helpless feeling of watching a child slip away despite everything she tried to do. Kenneth listened without judgment, his pale eyes reflecting the firelight as he absorbed her pain and guilt. "I lost my first wife in childbirth," he said when she finished. "The babe as well. I blamed myself for years, thinking I should have found a better healer, should have done something different. It took me a long time to understand that some things are beyond our control, that we can only do our best with the knowledge and resources we have." The revelation explained much about Kenneth's patient approach to their relationship, his willingness to let things develop naturally rather than forcing intimacy. He understood loss in the way it could shape a person's fears and hesitations. This shared experience of grief became another thread in the slowly strengthening bond between them. As autumn deepened into winter, Sharon began to feel more settled in her new life. She had established routines and relationships, found her place in the household's daily operations. Kenneth treated her with consistent respect and consideration, never presuming upon their arrangement or pushing for more than she was ready to give. The first real test of their partnership came with the arrival of Ethan Johnson, Sharon's former betrothed, who appeared at Ironhaven's harbor on a gray December morning with 2 companions and a purse full of silver. He had spent months tracking her through the slave markets and settlements of the Norse lands, following rumors and paying informants until he finally located her in Kenneth's household. Sharon was working in the hall when Jerry Powell brought word of the visitors, his expression troubled as he delivered the news that three Scottish merchants were asking to speak with Kenneth Campbell about purchasing a woman named Sharon Chavez. The name hit her like a physical blow, bringing back memories of her former life and the man she had once expected to marry. Kenneth's reaction was immediate and decisive. He called for his weapons and instructed Paul Long to gather several of the settlement's warriors, making it clear that he considered this a potential threat rather than a simple business transaction. Sharon appreciated his protective instincts, but she also knew that this confrontation was ultimately hers to handle. "I will speak with him," she told Kenneth as he prepared to meet the visitors at the harbor. "He deserves that much, at least." Kenneth studied her face, reading the determination in her expression. "I will be beside you," he said, "not as your master, but as your partner. The choice is yours to make, but you will not face it alone." The walk to the harbor felt like a journey through time, each step carrying Sharon further from the woman she had become and closer to the girl she had once been. Ethan waited by his hired boat, older and more weathered than she remembered, but still recognizably the merchant's son who had courted her with gifts of silk and promises of comfort. His face when he saw her was a mixture of relief and horror, taking in her Norse clothing and the confident way she walked beside Kenneth Campbell. This was not the broken victim he had expected to rescue, but a woman who had found her own way to survival in something approaching contentment. "Sharon," Ethan said, his voice heavy with emotion, "I have come to take you home." The word home hung in the air between them like a question neither was sure how to answer. Sharon looked at this man who represented her past, then at Kenneth, who stood silently beside her, offering his support without trying to influence her decision. "I am home," she said finally, the truth of the words surprising her with their clarity. "This is my home now, Ethan. These are my people." Ethan's face crumpled with disappointment and disbelief. "They are savages, Sharon. Vikings who took you by force. How can you choose them over your own kind? Over me?" The accusation stung because it contained just enough truth to wound. Sharon had been taken by Vikings, had been sold into slavery, had suffered at the hands of Norse masters. But she had also found strength she never knew she possessed, had discovered that survival could lead to something more than mere existence. "I choose Kenneth because he sees me as I am, not as what he wishes me to be," Sharon replied, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her heart. "He offers me partnership, not protection. He wants a woman beside him, not a possession to be guarded and displayed." Ethan's companions shifted restlessly behind him, hands moving toward their weapons as the tension in the air thickened. Kenneth's warriors had taken positions around the harbor, not threatening but clearly ready to act if the situation escalated. Sharon realized that her choice would determine whether this confrontation ended in words or blood. "I loved you," Ethan said, his voice breaking with the weight of his emotions. "I searched for you across half the known world. I have silver enough to buy your freedom and passage home. How can you throw all of that away for this barbarian?" Sharon felt a pang of sympathy for the man who had traveled so far and sacrificed so much in pursuit of a dream that no longer existed. The woman he had loved was gone, transformed by hardship and loss into someone he could no longer recognize or understand. "The woman you loved was a child," Sharon said gently. "She believed in fairy tales and happy endings, in the protection of walls and the safety of familiar things. That woman died in the slave markets of Jorvik. Ethan. I am what grew from her ashes." Kenneth stepped forward slightly, not threatening but making his presence felt. "The lady has made her choice," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of absolute conviction. "Honor it and depart in peace." For a moment, Sharon thought Ethan might challenge Kenneth to single combat, might demand the right to fight for her as men had done since the beginning of time. Instead, he seemed to deflate, the fight going out of him as he finally understood that his quest had been doomed from the start. "If you change your mind," he said, reaching into his purse and withdrawing a small silver pendant that Sharon recognized as her mother's, "send word to Ravenshollow. I will come for you no matter how long it takes." Sharon accepted the pendant with tears in her eyes, not for the life she was rejecting, but for the pain she was causing this good man who had loved her as best he knew how. Thank you, she whispered, for everything, for caring enough to look for me, for offering me a way back. But my path leads forward now, not backward. Ethan nodded once sharply and turned away before she could see him break. His companions followed him back to their boat, and within minutes they were pulling away from the harbor, carrying with them the last tangible link to Sharon's former life. Kenneth waited until the boat disappeared around the headland before speaking. Regrets? He asked, echoing his question from their first voyage together. Sharon looked down at the silver pendant in her palm, then up at the man who had given her the freedom to choose her own destiny. Sadness, she corrected, but no regrets. That night, for the first time since arriving in Ironhaven, Sharon went to Kenneth's chamber instead of her own. She did not go as a duty or obligation, but as a woman choosing to share her life with a man who had proven himself worthy of her trust. They came together as equals, partners in building something that would outlast them both. Spring brought the news that Sharon carried Kenneth's child, a son who would be born as the harvest season painted the world in shades of gold and crimson. She felt the life growing within her like a promise kept, a bridge between the woman she had been and the woman she was becoming. Standing on the cliffs above Ironhaven, watching the ships come and go in the harbor below, Sharon reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this place. She had lost everything she thought she wanted, only to discover what she truly needed. In the arms of a Viking warrior who had offered her sons instead of slavery, she had found not just survival, but the chance to thrive. The child kicked within her as if responding to her thoughts, and Sharon smiled, placing her hand over the swell of her belly. This little one would be born free, would grow up knowing both his Norse heritage and his mother's Scottish blood, would inherit the best of both worlds that had shaped his parents. Kenneth appeared beside her, his presence as solid and reassuring as the cliffs themselves. He placed his hand over hers, and together they stood watching the sun set over the water. Two people who had found in each other what they had never thought to seek. The Viking who had knocked on her cave and declared his intentions had given her far more than sons. He had given her a future worth living.